Now I want us to think about teaching Chinese pronunciation. Now I'm assuming that you have already had some experience of teaching Chinese and that therefore you're familiar with the Chinese pinyin system. And so I won't be introducing the Chinese pinyin system, but what I want to do is for us to focus on how to teach Chinese pinyin, and focusing particularly on those sounds that are more difficult for people whose English is their mother tongue. Now, what you need, and you can download it from the website, is a chart with the consonants and vowels of Mandarin Chinese. It's also helpful to have the chart of the consonants and vowels of English. And then thirdly, a chart with all the syllables, the 400 plus syllables in Chinese. And so we can compare English with Chinese. But let's start here. The air comes up from the lungs, passes through the glottis, the vocal cords, and either comes out through the mouth or the nose. Okay, I'll say again, the air comes up from the lungs and it passes through the glottis, which can either be open or closed. When it's closed, we call it a glottal stop. And the vocal cords that can either be vibrating or they can be stationary. And then the air comes out through the mouth or the nose, or with certain sounds comes out through the mouth and the nose at the same time. And as we look at the consonants and vowels, we can see where the student's difficulty might lie. In other words, if the sound is in English and in Mandarin Chinese, it's not going to be a problem. But when we see here what's called alveolar palatal, doesn't matter so much what it means, but we see that ji, qi, shi in Chinese doesn't have these sounds in English, then it's going to let us know that students may, and probably will, have problems with those sounds. So by comparing the consonants and the vowels of Mandarin and English, it's going to let us know where students' problems might lie. Now, what's helpful is that if you have certain teaching aids, one is to have some tissue or toilet paper. This is particularly helpful with the sounds with a lot of air, what you call aspirated sounds, to let the student know whether they're blowing air out. Secondly, it's often helpful to have a mirror and also a torch, a flashlight, so the student can see where their tongue is and whether or not it's in the correct place. So particularly teaching pronunciation, to have a mirror and a flashlight, a torch, are really helpful to the student. Also, it's best if the textbook you use has pictures in it of the position of the tongue and the shape of the lips, so that the student can see where their tongue should be. In other words, what we want to avoid is the teacher saying, say you, and the student says ooh, and the teacher says, no, just do what I'm doing, say you, and the teacher says ooh, and it just carries on like that, where pictures and using the mirror and the torch can be really helpful for the student. Now, Chinese has 21 consonants, what are called shengmu, or initials, 16 vowels, or what's called finals, yunmu, and 4 tones plus a 0 or a neutral tone. So let's start off by thinking how to teach the pronunciation. The teacher firstly reads and the student listens to the teacher. You should not say to the student, have a go, have a try, and I'll tell you whether or not you've got it right. No. The teacher reads as a model for the student, and the student simply listens to the teacher. Then the next step, the teacher reads again, and the student repeats after the teacher. And then the third stage, the student then reads, and the teacher corrects any errors. And then finally, testing the student. Two different tests that are very key. Firstly, a test of reading and speaking. So for instance, you write D-U-I, tone 4 on the board, and the student has to read that and say, 对. In other words, are they correctly associating the pinyin with the sound? That's very important. So writing on the board going to help them check their reading and speaking, whether or not they're correct. And then secondly, listening and writing. The teacher says lie, and the student has to write it down. This is testing whether the student hears it correctly and knows how to write the pinyin for that sound correctly. So these two tests, the teacher writes and the student says it, testing reading and speaking, and then the teacher says a word, lie, and the student has to write it down, testing whether the student hears it correctly and knows how to write it correctly. So here are the steps in teaching pronunciation. Now, how to deal with students' problems. Firstly, as I've already said, this is where pictures of the mouth, the lips, the tongue, and also the mirror and the torch are going to come in very useful, so the student can see where their tongue should be and can see the shape, the correct shape of the lips. What is key is what I like to call rehabilitation. Often the problem is that students go by feel. The teacher says a sound and the student tries to mimic it, and they're going by feel and are surprised when the teacher says, "You are wrong." And so we have to tell our students they have to deliberately think, where should my tongue be? What should be the shape of the lips? Rehabilitation. A few weeks ago, I went to a hospital near our home, and I went to the rehabilitation department. And in that room, there were people who were trying to get back the use of their arm or whatever it was. And so they deliberately had to think and then do certain actions and do them over and over again until they got them right. And you need to tell your students getting the correct pronunciation is the same. We need to think, where should my tongue be? What should be the shape of my lips? And deliberately think about putting them in the correct place. And so just like rehabilitation, you need to tell your students you need a lot of patience and self-discipline if they want to get the sounds right. Now, as teachers, don't keep correcting one sound for too long. If you do that, your student will lose heart. Work on a sound for a little while and then leave it alone. Let the student go home, think about it at home, practice it at home, and come back the next day. Often they will have improved as they've sort of slept on it or thought about it at home. Don't keep correcting for too long. Students will lose heart. But what is helpful is, if the student has a problem, say you can't say you correctly, tell them in the story in the textbook to highlight the words every time you comes, and then deliberately slow down and think about it when they come to that word. Focus on it and work on getting it right. And along with this, what's helpful for students is if you just focus on one sound at a time. For instance, supposing your student has 4 sounds that are not correct. Don't keep stopping them every time they make a mistake. No. Say to them, this week we're just going to focus on the U, and every time you get that wrong, I'm going to stop you, but I'm going to ignore all the other sounds. And I want you too to focus on it by highlighting in your book and thinking about it. And we want this week to get that one correct, and then next week we'll work on another one. That's going to be much more helpful for the student than stopping them every time they make any mistake, because it'll be easy for them to lose heart. Focus on one at a time. Okay, now let's move on firstly to the consonants. Consonants come in 6 groups, and the first group is to do with the lips. Let's look at the first one, B. And what's key to note about this is 2 things. Firstly, B is not voiced, and secondly, it's not aspirated. Let's think about that. What does that mean? Not voiced and not aspirated. If a sound is voiced, it means the vocal cords are vibrating. If I say a Z, Z, the vocal cords are vibrating. If I say an S, S, the vocal cords are not vibrating. Why don't you try it now? First say a Z, then say an S. Z, S, and again, Z, S. What you hear with the Z, the Z, the Z, are the vocal cords vibrating, and we call that a voiced sound. The B is not voiced. Secondly, as regards aspiration, aspiration is to do with air coming out. P is aspirated, but B is not